Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you so much for having me and for for selecting my paper. And I think the organizer went above and beyond because when I landed yesterday, I felt like he was in London with all the rain. So thank you again for having me here. So this is the first time I'm presenting not standing up. So apologies if from time to time I look back. But basically what I'm presenting is my paper on the environmental impact on basically what is the environmental impact on market concentration of firms. So this is what I'm going to present for you today. So I'm going to start with the motivation and research question. So basically, we heard a lot today already about why decarbonization is important. And I think there's no doubt that this is one of like the greatest challenge we will have in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime and grandchildren's lifetime, that climate change is very important and we need to act on it like we heard so eloquently before. So what I wanted to tease out here is one of the basically main policy challenges nowadays for government is to act on decarbonization. And a lot of, we've seen before, but a lot of government actually put in place policy for decarbonization. One of the most famous one is the European one, which is the EU ETS. But on the other hand, for people more familiar with what we get taught are like bachelor level economics, well-functioning markets have always been the paramount of what like government care about. And we know that if markets are not competitive, actually there are like ripple effect in terms of negative effects. So this quote here states that actually we think about like firms competition in terms of like making sure that the economy works well, there is like good circulation of workers, there is no dumping in capital and so forth. But why am I studying the two together? So when I start thinking about this paper, actually there are very few papers that look at what are the combination of like competition policy on environmental policy. And if you look in many government, the two actually agencies tend sometimes to work in silo and they don't think about like basically how the two interplay. So that's why I was interested in what is the impact of competition policy on environmental policy. So while we focus a lot as academics on, you know, like the academia and policy, sometimes we leave aside the private sector, but actually, if we look at what a lot of these like green consultant or environment consultant are suggesting to the companies to do, a lot of them are telling companies to actually merge with other companies to improve their environmental performance. If you look, this is just from BCG, but you will find a lot of similar consulting like paper that they say, oh, you know, if you want to become a greener firm, why don't you just acquire a firm that has like maybe a greener asset base or a greener technology? So this is something that actually a lot of consulting firms are actively suggesting to the companies that they do. So I'm going to show you two examples of mergers that will have very different impact on emission. So on the left-hand side, you will see Chevron. Chevron is a very famous oil company. And in the past 5 years, Chevron have been acquired throughout the US, a lot of oil rigs and smaller oil companies that they were basically failing and going bankrupt. So in this case, you can imagine that once Chevron actually acquired this company, the emission will go up because Chevron will be able to inject capital in these companies. And actually, what does this mean? That they will be able to produce more and then the emission will go up. On the other side, we see Ford. We all associate Ford with cars, and cars are very polluting products. However, Ford is really trying to change the image that the consumer have of them. So recently, they've been investing a lot in green technology. So they invested in this company called Rivian. So basically, which is an electric car company. And so what they've been doing is they try to acquire the tech and the IT and the R&D from Rivian. So they've been trying to basically also green themselves by purchasing this green IP from this other company. So in terms of my research question, so what is my research question? So I was really interested in study what is the market consolidation impact on environmental performance of firms. And especially in this case, I'm going to look at emissions. What I'm going to study here specifically is mergers, because mergers are what basically gets scrutinized a lot by competition authorities and by competition policies. And then also it's important for policymakers to know that there could be a trade-off between setting a good competition policy and setting a good environmental policy. That's where this paper stems from, is that there is a trade-off, and we as academic or as policymakers should be aware of this trade-off when setting out policy. And if you just want to have a key takeaway from this paper, is that actually my paper showed that following a merger, so an increase in market concentration, we actually see that emissions do decrease. And this teases out the fact that the two policies tend to be a bit at odds with each other. So I don't have time to go through the literature in detail. There's a lot of old literature on like market concentration and mergers, and also there's some more new literature on consumer being really interested in the environmental performance of the firms they buy their products from. So what this paper does in terms of marginal contribution to the literature, this is the first paper to my knowledge that try to understand what are the non-market outcome of mergers in terms of environmental performance. So in terms of data, so I do have this proprietary data from S&P Capital IQ. So I have the universe of all mergers happening throughout the past 50 years. However, I only use from 2006 because that's where we see the first ETS program. So that's where we see the first actually good quality of data coming in terms of emission. And I match this data with actually emission level data still from S&P Capital IQ. And in terms of emissions, so I'm really interested in scope 1 at this stage. So for people not familiar with how we classify emissions, so scope 1 are called direct emissions. So there is emission that came directly from the operation of a company, while scope 2 are indirect emissions, so from like purchasing energy from other company. And there's also scope 3, which is like the footprint of the whole company. So in this paper, just for you to be aware of, I'm going to be talking about scope 1. Also, to be clear on what I mean in terms of mergers, I don't differentiate as of now in terms of friendly merger, hostile takeover, and so forth. At this point in time, I just consider them the same, but I'm currently extending the paper to separate between the two. So this is my sample. So for people that are more familiar to the industrial organization literature, I got this question asked a lot. There are way more mergers than what you're showing. It's just because I'm only considering in my samples the company that actually I have emission pre and post merger. And you can see the majority, and I'm only also consider OECD countries. And you can see the majority of my sample is concentrated in the US and a bit in the UK and Canada. And then in terms of the sector cover, majority of my sector is actually manufacturing. This for me is actually good news because we all know the manufacturing sector is the most polluting sector. So it's quite important to understand what's going on there. Okay, in terms of the theoretical framework. So I have a toy model in my paper, which I won't have time to go through. So I'm just gonna quickly talk through the setup and then the main results of the paper. Of the model, sorry. So basically the model is, there is a competition, oligopoly style competition a la Bertrand. And basically consumers are environmental cautious. So they actually have a sort of preference on whether you as a company are more environmentally friendly or not, and that actually affects their demand. Another thing is that, of course, firms that basically like increase their output will also increase their emissions. So emissions and output go the same way. Firms can decide to merge or not. In the model, we take this as completely exogenous. And the other thing is that is quite important here is that before they set prices, these firms actually can decide to invest in a technology which has a price K. And if they invest in this technology, is a technology that actually reduces the level of marginal emission per output. So if they invest in this green technology, it means that the production will be more efficient. So it's a sort of like the example I was showing you is a sort of like Ford acquiring this IT from this electric car, and then there will be a bit greener later on. So the results of the model very quickly is that basically what happens is that actually mergers push the incentive for innovate higher, so that they increase the incentive to innovate. And also there is a trade-off between market power and emission. So what happens there is that actually after a merger, the emission can reduce for two reasons. The first reason is that I basically spend in green R&D, and then by acquiring this technology, I actually end up maybe producing even more, but my emission go down because my technology is now cleaner. But on the other hand, if I'm a standard monopolistic or oligopolistic player, I can also decide to reduce my output. And if I reduce my output, then the emission will go down. It will be a simple like mechanic exercise there. So what we want to tease out here is what is the dominant mechanism. Unfortunately, it will be very hard to understand what is the dominant mechanism at this stage, but this in your mind, you should think about is this trade-off. And of course, as a policymaker, I could allow for the first mechanism to happen, but it would be very dangerous for me to allow for the second mechanism to happen. So now talking about the empirical framework. So now I'm going to talk about what I consider my I. So the unit of interest of my paper. So basically, when I talk about I, it's not going to be a single firm, but I'm going to call them composite firms. So what does that mean? So basically, a composite firm, as you can see on the left-hand side panel, they're both composite firms, left and right. But on the left-hand side, I really show you why I don't consider my unit of interest a single firm. If at the beginning of the sample on the left-hand side, I have firm A, B, and C, and then in T1, we see A and B merging. And then in T2, we see A, B merging with C. So where T2 is the end of my sample, then that will be a composite firm. So I will consider that as a unitary firm for my analysis. While in the right-hand side, we have company D. In my sample, company D never merged, so it's considered a unit of interest. Why I need to do this? Unfortunately, a lot of companies that tend to merge a lot throughout my sample. So the same company will merge maybe 20 times in a year. So if I just consider a single merger between two companies, I wouldn't be able to compare the impact of emission. I have to use this like composite firm in order to understand the impact of each and single merger that happens for the companies. So the first part of my empirical strategy is a very simple event study model. On the left-hand side, I have log of emissions for the composite firm. And then on the right-hand side, the beta, basically what I see is that the event study. So if merger happen is 1, if it doesn't happen is 0. And then we all know that basically this is a very endogenous strategy because actually firms can self-select into mergers. Again, maybe style takeovers is not the case, but as I said earlier, I'm now considering mergers all the same. So to try to extrapolate from the endogeneity of my specification, I also use an instrumental variable a la Bartik. So for people familiar with Bartik instrument, they basically are composed of two basically components. There is a component that change within like a cross section. So for each I, the component will be a bit different. It will be how much you're exposed to a shock. And there is a component will change within time. So within time, how much you will be exposed to the shock. So how do I build basically like my instrument? So the first thing I do is I try to understand how much you're exposed to what we call in the industrial organization literature merger waves. So what happens in this literature is a lot of the time actually mergers tend to happen for reasons that are not dependent on the decision of the two companies as well. So there are periods of time in which there are a lot of mergers happening, and this is because maybe there are like good economic conditions at the stage. So for example, in a lot of cases when there are like change in interest rates, some companies go very close to bankruptcy and then they tend to be acquired by other companies. So there are a lot of mergers, and we saw that in the past years or two that there were a lot of mergers because of the spike in interest rates. There could also be like technological improvement in a sector, which means that now there is a very precious patent in the sector and all the companies try to merge with the company because now that company will be dominant in the sector. And there could also be a case where there are a lot of like managerial competition or managerial basically like they compete for the same spot. So what they end up doing is they end up merging the firms. So what happens in that case, in these merger waves, is we try to, basically what I try to do here is I try to understand, when I do this merger index, I try to understand how many times this composite firm will merge within the sample. So in this case, because I have 3 firms and in the end, at the end of my sample, they will all be merged. So in this case, at time 0, this merger index will be 3. At times 1, sorry, it will be 2, and at times 2, it will be 1. What does it mean is that it gives me a sort of idea of the concentration of the sector and the concentration of the firm itself. So the share part of my instrument will be how much each unit of interest is exposed to being merged to. So what I do here is I take some standard finance literature that basically says that if you have a lot of debt at the beginning of the sample, you're more likely to be basically acquired by another company. So the share are simply like the proportion of debt you have or the likelihood of you being acquired. And then I interacted with this time varying sort of aspect of the instrument. And this simply is what I was telling you before, is how many merger waves there are in a sector which is not your sector. So what this instrument will tell me is how much you as a company are likely to be acquired because you have a high level of debt, and how much you are likely to be affected by a merger wave. And I'm like texting this in the sector that you are not in. So, I mean, I talked about this already. So the instrument will be the interaction between the two. And then my first stage will be like, okay, how much my instrument affect my likelihood of merging throughout time. And then the second stage will be how much my likelihood of merging throughout time affect my emissions. So now quickly moving on to results. So firstly, I'm going to show you graphically the event study results, and then I'm going to show you with numbers the instrument results. So apologies, on the y-axis, these are percentage points. So it's like 10%, 20%, 50%. So we see that basically already from time -1 to time 0, emission actually decreased by 10%. So we see that actually companies already that they already know they will merge, they start decreasing their emission already at the time they merge. And a decrease of 10% is actually massive. If you consider like a couple of these manufacturing companies, they're the leading polluter companies throughout the world. It has been studied that actually only like capping manufacturing pollution by 5% will have a massive effect on the reduction of like temperature in like 5 to 10 years. So this is actually a massive positive impact of mergers. This is the same, but I'm just showing you like in terms of like I do a propensity score matching. So the orange line is basically a company that never merged. And the blue line is a company that does merge, where 0 is the time at the merger. So you can see that in -1, there are pre-trends. But already when moving to 0 and going forward, the path of decrease of emission is quite clear, while the path of orange is quite different. So you can see that already in this event study, already like -1 could be like sort of the treatment time more than 0, because at that time already the emissions are almost 10% lower. And in terms of the instrument, so you see here that I use different controls, but in all the specification and no matter the control used, actually emission always tend to decrease. So if you're a company that is exposed to merger waves and that is more likely to merge, actually you tend to have a decrease in emission by basically like from 10% to approximately 4%. When I actually control for this sort of year fixed effect and firm fixed effect, the decrease is quite significant. So finally, to conclude my key takeaways. So I showed you that in all specification, mergers tend to decrease actually emissions. And this is quite an important and interesting result. And this is like the main novelty of my paper. But basically what would be important to understand and what will be the extension is what is the key mechanism. As I said before, if the key mechanism is just a question of like increase market power and decrease output, then policymakers should be alerted. And that's something that should be really like taken into account. But if it's a question of more investment into green R&D and a case of like the output still staying the same or increasing, but the production becoming greener, then maybe this is something that could be allowed or like should be taken into consideration. So I think that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for your time and for swapping me around. Yeah, of course.
This composite firm which you have each event that's the event when there is an A and B, but not
Yeah.
counts the same, is considered the same, where the duplication thing, which is when C also gets added. And is there a way to get rid of this assumption of these sub-events of the big composite identified?
Yeah, no, it's clear. It's a fair point. So what I didn't talk about due to time is that when I do the event, I actually basically do some adjustment in terms of like the size of the company. So what I'm saying here is that there is the composite firm joined from A to B. It will be different than from A to B joined with C. So the event will be considered a bit different because I will control for the size of the firm at that stage in time. So basically, the event will be a different impact because you will consider only the size of the firm that is existing with the new size of the firm. So by doing this sort of like control at event time, I do tend to control with the fact that you're right. When A merge with B is very different when A, B merge with C. They're different companies. But I do control for them with size. And also like I do take into account log of pre-emission. So that should already tell me like what's the difference. So that should neutralize the company that hasn't merged with them yet in my results. Thank you. If there are no further questions, then I'll leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you so much.